Ah, the darn Stamp Act! Causing so many problems. So many problems, in fact, that the Stamp Act is pretty much the beginning of the end when it comes to good relations between the American colonies and England. So, how do people respond to the Stamp Act? Well, in Boston, certainly they take some extreme measures. Here you can see that they're burning it. They get pretty more intense after that. So, but what other methods do people have of expressing their anger over the Stamp Act? Well, first one, we have Patrick Henry and the Virginia Resolutions. Now, Patrick Henry, he is a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, also known as the Virginia Assembly. Now, the Virginia Assembly, the Virginia House of Burgesses, they, for shortly thereafter the founding of Virginia, have been in charge of running the colony. So after the Stamp Act is passed, the members of the Virginia Assembly, they are getting together in a meeting. Patrick Henry, he gets up and says that we should consider discussing the Stamp Act. Many Virginians are shocked by him, as they consider that any law passed by England needs to be followed by the colonies. However, Patrick Henry says, "Gentlemen, the Stamp Act has been forced upon us by a sick king. I understand that in Williamsburg it is considered ill-mannered to refer to King George's fits of insanity. The act is, in my humble opinion, illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust." At the time, King George, he is, there's some rumors that he has some mental fits, some insanity perhaps. So not as only is Patrick Henry calling on the fact that the king might not even be in a right mind to be running the colonies, but that in fact the law that has been passed, the Stamp Act, is illegal. So this man, Patrick Henry, right here, he then proposes a number of resolutions. And not all of them are passed by the Virginia Assembly, but a number of them are. And they include the idea that settlers have the privileges and rights of the people of Great Britain. So these rights and privileges that everyone in Great Britain enjoys are enjoyed also by American colonists. And one of those rights is self-taxation. In England, the citizens have the ability to, well, some of them have the ability to elect members of the House of Commons. So that for most people, well, at least some people, they have this ability to vote. And since the Virginia Assembly is in the colonies, that right of voting, since it was actually given to the Virginia Assembly, and the king has always recognized this. So taxation has always been allowed to be done internally by the colonies. This idea of salutary neglect, that England is allowing the colonies to operate on their own, to pass their own laws, and this has not been something they have been prevented from doing. Only, Patrick Henry claims, is the Virginia Assembly allowed to tax, and any attempt to surrender this power would destroy freedom. The inhabitants of the colony do not have to follow any laws except those passed in the Virginia Assembly, and anyone who disagrees is an enemy of the colony. So he closes out with some pretty bold claims. Not only is this tax that's coming upon them from England destroying their freedom, in fact, the inhabitants do not even have to follow these taxes, but because they are illegal. And those who disagree, well, they're an enemy. Rumor has it, he makes the claim, "Give me liberty or give me death." A famous saying in this time has not been particularly proven, but this is very much a beginning, the first big vocal statement against the Stamp Act, and really against the powers of England. What powers do England have in the American colonies? And it's really drawing a line between enemies. People that agree with England and people that agree with. Now, Massachusetts is certainly not shying away from any conflict, and it, after the Virginia resolutions, two men, businessmen, this is John Hancock on the left and Sam Adams on the right, they organize a group called the Sons of Liberty. And Sons of Liberty are, their goal is to really create protests in the streets. And the two main, well, there's two main focuses of their anger. The first one, this man, Andrew Oliver. If you look at the paper down there, Andrew Oliver is mentioned. This is a pamphlet from 1765. Andrew Oliver, he is the tax collector. He's the agent that sells the stamps for the tax. So he's in charge of really making sure that this Stamp Act is enforced and that the money is going back to England. How do the Bostonians respond to this? Well, they form a mob. They go to his house, and they tear it to the ground. Not only do they tear his house to the ground, but they tear the Stamp Act office to the ground. So Mr. Andrew Oliver, he has been dehoused, and the Stamp Act office that's in charge of this, government building, has also been torn down. Now, Governor Hutchinson, he is the other object of anger. He is appointed by the King of England to govern Massachusetts, and Governor Hutchinson, he also has a house, and a mob also tears it down. They go to his house, destroy his property, steal whatever money he has, and generally create great destruction. Now, this shouldn't be much of a surprise, as Massachusetts doesn't really shy away from violence and anger. So the Bostonians are taking a much more active role in protesting. Shortly thereafter, the Stamp Act Congress meets in October 1765, and it generally includes members. It meets in New York City, and representatives from most of the colonies are sent. One colony straight up refuses to send representatives, and some other colonies cannot make it. But the colonies create a resolution, 14 resolutions actually, but they generally are in agreement that they are all subjects of the king, so they're not denying that, but the taxes cannot be imposed upon them without their own consent, which means they need representation before there can be taxation. So the whole idea of no representation, or no taxation without representation. And since the Stamp Act was put into place without representation, then in fact it needs to be repealed. And to kind of force the English to repealing the act, colonists then start boycotting goods. They start saying, all right, well, you're going to tax these goods, we're just not going to buy them. And this boycott, some business owners do not want to boycott because they're selling goods. This is their business. If you are caught, though, selling English goods, often these business owners' names would be published in the paper, and people would in turn boycott the store, or worse, chase the merchants, the store owners, out of town. So you have this boycott, and in response to all of this, there's violence, petitions, resolutions, boycotts. Finally, the Parliament, it repeals it. It gets rid of the Stamp Act, and this is what this cartoon here shows: the repeal, the death, the funeral procession of the Stamp Act. And it's taken away. The Americans win. But at the very end, while England Parliament does get rid of the Stamp Act, they issue what's known as the Declaratory Act, which generally states that the inhabitants of America, the colonies that exist there, are under control of England. They are under control of Parliament. And Parliament and the King have full right. It is within their power, and they have this right. It is something that they will use to make laws and to enforce them. So while they are saying, all right, we are taking rid of this act, any other act that we want to pass, we can and we will. So something to think about, and which we will discuss in our debate on Monday, will be the question of whether the colonists are justified in their actions to protest. Were these methods of protest right? Or did they cross a line? Because remember that these are possessions of the King of England. These are possessions of England. So were the actions the colonists took justified? And some of them you might say yes, and some of them you might just say no, or you might say no to all of them, or yes to some of them. So feel. So think about that. Justification.